My name is Julie Kelly. I did not get into the University of Chicago, nor the University of Illinois, so I went to Eastern Illinois University. But I'm born and raised in the suburbs, and I worked a lot in politics. That's how this all morphed into where I am now. So I worked for elected officials in DuPage County, which is west of here. Used to be a very red county, and they just elected their first Democrat county board chairman. I worked for 2 county board chairmen who are both Republicans. So that's sort of how I got my start. I did a lot of communication work in politics, writing speeches and messaging, development, press releases, that sort of thing. So that's my background in terms of how I got into writing and reporting. I was a stay-at-home mom for 10 years and then sort of got back into politics and then just kind of took off from there. So started writing for some different outlets, National Review, The Federalist. I had some pieces posted in the Wall Street Journal, The Hill, Roll Call. I was writing about GMOs, really food issues, agricultural, biotech issues. That morphed into climate change and just this whole progression. Anyway, so before January 6th, I was writing a lot in 2020 about lockdowns. I was very anti-lockdown from the beginning, opposed even the first 15 days. Especially, I had a daughter in college at the time. She was at Syracuse, and she was out of school. My high schooler at Sandburg was also out of school. So I wrote a lot about that. Then the election happened, then January 6th happened, and here I am almost 3 years later. I think, how could I be writing about this for almost 3 years? But as you can see, it's an important issue. I know Perry was saying it, and you were saying also, whenever there's a speaker here of any caliber, especially a Republican, they're asked a lot about January 6th. And so my book that came out in January of 2022 talks about how the Democrats are using it to launch a war on terror against the right. And at the time when I turned in my manuscript, the end of 2021, that was a very incendiary, inflammatory, conspiracy theorist thing to say. Tucker Carlson, of course, had produced his 3-piece documentary called The Patriot Purge, which sort of was along the same lines. Anyway, now here we are. That seemed like a conspiracy theory. And now the Biden regime and the Democrats and the media are actually bragging that that is the case. That they have turned the war on terror that was used for the first war on terror after 9/11, using those tools now against American citizens. So that's sort of the background. So I know you've got some questions, and then I'm happy to take questions from anybody else as well. Okay. Because I know you guys have been saturated in January 6th coverage, propaganda, harassment probably since that happened. So.
Well, great. Well, thank you for the introduction. I think to start, maybe before any questions I have prepared, just something I was thinking maybe you could discuss a little bit what some of the similar tactics, strategies between the war on terror and January 6th persecution that you see. What would be your summary of that?
So that's a great question. You have people like me after 9/11 and a lot of people on the right who fully endorsed the use of, say, the Patriot Act and extensive surveillance powers that were turned over to the federal government to try to hunt down, what we were told, foreign terrorists. And there were a few at the time, Ron Paul was one of them, who said, okay, if you give the government this sort of power, they're never going to relinquish it, and then they're going to turn it against our own people. And that's exactly what happened. Gradually started happening before January 6th. We saw that 2018, the FBI declared domestic violent extremist, a top threat. So this was sort of already being set up. So to your point, just the overall surveillance state. For example, the use of FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, that enabled all the spying power on foreign terror cells and anyone tied to what they would call lone wolves here. Well, so we know what happened 2016. They used the FISA courts, and they used the fabricated Steele dossier. They went to the secret court and got approval 4 different times, actually, to use that extensive power, which isn't just against the individual, it's called two hops, so then it extended to Donald Trump and the whole campaign to spy on them. So of course, this all happened during the Obama administration. So much of what we see was Barack Obama using what he learned right here in Chicago, which is how to leverage government agencies and authority to punish your political foes and reward your friends. So that was just happening on a much bigger scale. So I think that's some of the,
Yeah.
and the entrapment issue, we saw that in the Whitmer Fednapping hoax. We now know how much of the FBI was setting up what they called Muslim terror cells, or, to create the idea that you had all of these Muslims here who were working with Al-Qaeda. They were going to blow up the Sears Tower. They were going to blow up, military installations. They were going to shoot down airplanes. Well, now we see, in retrospect, that a lot of that was an FBI entrapment. And you saw the same with the Whitmer Fednapping hoax. I've written a lot about that. If you really want a backstory on what this FBI is capable of doing, read my stuff or anyone's on what happened with the alleged plot to kidnap Gretchen Whitmer. And, we saw a lot of FBI involvement in January 6th. So I think those are some of the most glaring similarities.
Yeah, the Institute of Politics actually just had Whitmer here 2 weeks ago, something like that. So I guess
No one tried to kidnap her?
No, I mean maybe.
No feds?
Yeah, not that I detected.
Okay,
but,
that's good.
Who knows?
Maybe, right.
So I guess in connection with what you were talking about, kind of wielding the bureaucracy to pursue political opponents, my first question is kind of about that, which is looking at some of your recent explanations, like on your Substack, talk about how the Department of Justice has uniquely applied an unfair standard to President Trump by indicting him on different charges in different jurisdictions under a pretty condensed time frame. So maybe you could go into a little more detail about what makes that so unique, and do you agree or not with Trump's counsel's assessment that prosecutors are violating his rights to due process?
So I know a couple of you I talked to are thinking about law school or want to go to law school. So for those of you who do, you're looking at really an unprecedented legal territory in the United States, which is weaponizing statutes like obstruction of an official proceeding, 1512C2, which was passed after the aftermath of the Enron scandal. And it was intended to kind of close this loophole of people who are trying to obstruct criminal investigation, tampering with evidence, tampering with witnesses. The language is very vague in the C2 part of it. So what has happened is this DOJ has weaponized that language and turned it into a way to criminalize political dissent. So you've got an obstruction law that was passed really to deal with corporate interference, corporate malfeasance with any kind of investigation, and now turned it against more than 300 American citizens who protested at the Capitol. This is also one of the 4 counts in Special Counsel Jack Smith's indictment against Donald Trump for January 6th. So that's just one example of how this DOJ is weaponizing the law. And furthermore, with the almost complete complicity of the federal courts in Washington, D.C., both the district level and the appellate level, the circuit court level. So I call the courthouse the rubber stamp of whatever this DOJ wants, and that's really one example. Now, the long-term consequences of that, you've got 300 plus people who have been charged, dozens have been convicted at trial, a lot of people take plea deals because they don't want to deal with a jury made up of voters from a city that voted 92% for Joe Biden and have unique contempt for Donald Trump and his supporters. And you've got people who are going to jail for years convicted of this obstruction felony. So think of the long-term consequences of that. It's not just going to relate to people who interrupted a congressional meeting. A lot of people didn't even go in the building, or they went in after the joint session had already convened. So how can you obstruct an official proceeding that was already over a half hour, an hour, before you went into the building? So this can be applied in other federal jurisdictions. It could apply to any sort of federal proceeding. And you are going to empower U.S. attorneys across the country to use this Enron statute to further criminalize dissent, which then has the result of silencing political speech and activity. And so right now you've got 1,200 Americans who have been charged for their participation in January 6th. They've got new arrests announced today. They arrested 2 women from Tampa on misdemeanor counts. They raided a house, a man in New Jersey. Some of you might have seen, if you follow me on Twitter, you certainly know about this. The guy escaped, so there's an FBI manhunt. They've got helicopters. They've got police dogs. They've locked down the neighborhood. This is for a guy who allegedly sprayed police officers with chemical spray on January 6th. Now, think of what you see in this city or any big city, or what we saw in Washington throughout 2020, or any city. They now have armed FBI raids with SWAT teams almost 3 years later, terrorizing neighborhoods and arresting a man for spraying Capitol Police or DC Metro with the chemical spray. This is intended for all of us to see it as well, right? This is why you saw ABC News, David Muir with 8 million viewers, why he showed what happened to this man in New Jersey, because it's a message to all of us that, look, they're not going to stop. They're going to keep going. Yes, it was almost 3 years ago, but it doesn't matter. This is ongoing, and I think they plan on arresting at least 3,000 people before the statute of limitations is over on this.
Well, maybe we can talk about some of the facts of some of the more specific arrests. So one that I had in mind was looking at, Judge Tim Kelly, no relation.
No, thank God. I wish we were. I would have a word or two with him at Thanksgiving dinner.
But so he, among other people, he sentenced Joseph Biggs to 17 years in prison for shaking a temporary metal fence. He deemed that act terrorism.
Right.
Could you discuss the Biggs case a little bit more, and maybe more generally discuss the fairness or lack thereof of the January 6th defendant's sentencing?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one. So Joe Biggs was a member of the Proud Boys, so I covered a lot of the Proud Boys trial, 4-month trial. Judge Tim Kelly, a Trump-appointed judge, supposed to be, conservative, but certainly supposed to honor his oath of office, which is to protect the rights of defendants against government overreach, and there are no judges in Washington, D.C. who are doing that. So the Proud Boys case was particularly egregious because these men, Joe Biggs was arrested in January 2021. The Proud Boys, as you may or may not know, actually Joe was working with the FBI because the Proud Boys were showing up in places like Portland, in places like Seattle, and certainly Washington, D.C. They were there to help police deal with BLM and Antifa rioters in these cities, and sort of bolster their numbers and confront these left-wing activists. So Joe Biggs was actually working with the FBI because they would kind of figure out where these groups were going to be, and he was working with the FBI. Well, little did he know he really was being set up by the FBI, he and other Proud Boys. There were at least 24 FBI informants run into the Proud Boys months before January 6th, and on January 6th on the ground with them at the first sort of breach point. Anyway, Joe Biggs, a Purple Heart veteran, I think he had 2 tours of duty, Iraq and Afghanistan, never had a criminal record. Joe, I would watch in court, there were 5 defendants in the seditious conspiracy case, and I always felt really bad for Joe. He's a single father, he's got a 4-year-old daughter. Anyway, he was arrested in January 2021, denied release. A lot of J6ers, even on nonviolent crimes, and at that point he just had obstruction and conspiracy, denied release, held in the DC gulag, some of them. Joe actually stayed in Florida, for almost 2 years before he went to trial. In the process, Judge Tim Kelly not only denied his release repeatedly, but more importantly, denied change of venue for this very high-profile trial. Jury selection was taking place in Washington at the same time the January 6th Select Committee was holding televised nighttime hearings, specifically talking about the Proud Boys and mentioning the defendants by name. And you had jury selection that was starting in the same city. The day the January 6th Select Committee report dropped at the end of December is when they formally started the trial proceedings. There was no way these guys were going to get a fair trial, and of course they didn't. So anyway, of course, they're all convicted. 4 of the 5 convicted of seditious conspiracy. The government came back and I think they wanted for Joe Enrique Tarrio, who was the leader of the Proud Boys, who was in Baltimore on January 6th, by the way, wasn't even there. Dominic Pizzolo is not convicted. 2 others convicted, Ethan Nordine. Anyway, sorry for, I'll think of the last one. I can't believe I did that. So at any rate, they're charged. The government came back, and I think for Joe Biggs wanted 30 plus years in prison for him. And for Enrique Tarrio, I think they wanted life for one of them. Zach Reel. And the government came back and asked for terrorism enhancement. And what that meant was then that would add prison time to these already excessive prison sentences for men who had already been in jail by the time they were convicted in May of 2023 this year. They had already been in jail for 2.5 years. So the government wanted terrorism enhancement based on the fact that any destruction of government property in the process of seditious conspiracy is terrorism. So Judge Kelly said, yeah, shaking a temporary metal fence, you're trying to destroy government property. So yeah, that rises to a federal crime of terrorism. So he allowed the terrorism enhancement. Enrique Tarrio sentenced to 22 years in prison. Joe Biggs sentenced to 17 years. Ethan Nordine, 14 years. Zach Reel, 12 years, I believe. Also a veteran, Zach Reel. And the government has recently come back and they're appealing those sentences. They want the maximum amount of time that they ask for. This is how depraved, sadistic these prosecutors, this Department of Justice, these line prosecutors who are just as bad, and these judges are. These men's lives are completely destroyed, but it's not enough. They want as much blood out of them as they could possibly get. So I think the more disturbing thing, I know we're talking about of laws and the sentencing, is you're dealing with people in our nation's capital who hate half this country, and they are gratified by inflicting pain on people. They are not there to uphold the law. They don't care about the Constitution. They certainly don't care about this country. The only thing that they care about is wielding their power against powerless people because they had the audacity to support Donald Trump and protest Joe Biden's election. And this is ongoing. And when I walk out of those courtrooms, that's the feeling that I get, that there's something really deeply wrong with the people who are in charge of that judicial and legal system. And I as young people, I want you to really understand what you're up against. You know, you can read all of it and see it, but the people who are behind it, that's what I have found the most disturbing in covering all of this. The fact that they want to go back and try to keep these guys in jail even longer, there's something really wrong with that.
Well, I guess, so my next question then would be, because you're talking about these gargantuan sentences, you're talking about terrorism enhancement on top of those gargantuan sentences. We've heard for the last, well, really since January 6th, I guess shortly after, we've heard a lot of media back and forth, political back and forth about Ray Epps. And, some people say he did do such and such. Some people say it's all a debunked conspiracy theory. So my question would be, what did Ray Epps do? And given this whole system of maximal sentencing, enhancing those maximal sentences, does it make sense that he received one misdemeanor charge?
Right. So the Ray Epps, everyone knows who that is. And I do want to talk about Elias, too. I don't want to forget about him. So Ray Epps is a perfect example of the government protecting people who they want to protect. Ray Epps should have been charged with numerous offenses, including felonies such as obstruction of an official proceeding, civil disorder, certainly interfering with law enforcement. The government finally, when was it, August, charged him with one misdemeanor, a slap on the wrist, essentially. They lied about his presence at the Capitol. I actually have a piece on my Substack. We went very carefully through video on the west side of the building that day. We saw him engaged with law enforcement. We saw him arguing with law enforcement. These are activities that have gotten people slapped with harsh charges and prison time. And he was at the first exterior breach point, he was at the second exterior breach point, and he was on restricted grounds, which that whole area was, for nearly 2 hours. So why then, when people like Tucker and Darren Beatty at Revolver started asking, why is he escaping any sort of punishment? Now, he has testified that he wasn't an FBI asset or informant, that he never was, but that doesn't mean that he was not there in some other capacity. So he's still being protected. The government has still lied about what he did that day. And, he was inciting people to go to the Capitol the night before, so much so that people were chanting Fed, because he was so suspicious in what he was saying that they were referring to him as a Fed. So it just didn't make any sense that everyone who was involved in January 6th is a domestic terrorist, an insurrectionist, has to have the book thrown at him. But then suddenly they all came to the rescue of Ray Epps, including Liz Cheney, Adam Kinzinger, the whole January 6th committee, corporate media, put their arms around him, big, fuzzy Ray Epps. All of a sudden, one guy who's not an insurrectionist. This made no sense. It still doesn't make any sense. So I'm not sure how much we're ever going to get the truth about his exact ties to whom. Could it be a government agency? Could it be a Democratic organization? I mean, look, we were told for years Christopher Steele, the dossier, was just a British spy, ex-British spy. And it turns out, of course, not only was he paid by the DNC and Clinton campaign, but he was an FBI informant at the same time. So it could be really years before we'll get the full story of Ray Epps. But I don't believe that he just went there to help out his son, see Trump's speech, and wanted to protest the election. None of it adds up, and the cover-up, it makes it even all the more questionable.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. I think we'd like to.
Can I say one quick thing?
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah.
So brave, because I'm really disgusted at the young people who were charged and arrested for this. College students. An 18-year-old boy was the senior, homeschooled in Atlanta. In fact, the fact that he was homeschooled, the government used that against his parents, that they had brainwashed him, and they actually wanted to arrest the parents as well for taking him. That was the first, Bruno Kua, that was the first hearing I listened to, and really what got me involved in all of this. But Elias, so brave, and evidence that people can go on with their lives after the government tries to destroy it. But the case he's referring to, the 19-year-old, is a boy named Nord Meekum from rural Utah, one of 10 children. He was 19. He went to the Capitol with his uncle that day, didn't assault police officers, didn't vandalize any property. His uncle was arrested, I think, in May. Nord then was arrested a month or so later. When he found out, the judge set his arraignment day, the day that his arraignment, meaning he was going to go before the court and plead not guilty, he shot himself in the head. His father found him. This is a terrifying, horrible story. It's also, I'm not trying to, but you can read the details of it. I don't want it in the Substack from the police report how his father found him. He was still alive, partially alive, and the father called the ambulance, came and took him, but he did not survive. He's one of 4 January 6 defendants who we know of who have committed suicide. Another was Matthew Perna. There were 2 other men, 1 other man last summer. So because this young man saw what has happened to January 6 defendants and their families and their lives, you have to presume, did not want himself to go through that, or certainly this close family he had, family of 10, living on a ranch in Utah, posing no threat to anyone. So just one of the more heartbreaking stories, but that's who Elias was talking about. And this has been a destructive force for so many families, and it's as I said, it's not stopping. So.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for that. This has been fantastic, and I think I wanted to leave ample time for audience Q&A. So if anyone has a question, just fire away or raise your hand. I guess raise your hand. I don't know. All right, Tyler.
I'll start. So it seems, right now we're in the middle Republican presidential primary for second place. And so my question is, what, it seems like the only way out for a lot of these people who have been unjustly treated by the justice system is a presidential pardon or something of that sort. What are your thoughts on if, Republican president gets in there? I don't know if you've spoken to any of the campaigns or anything like that. Who would be, that would be something that they would seriously consider and would probably bring justice to these horrible things.
I think it's such an important issue for the base, and I think that most Republican presidential candidates don't understand that at all. Obviously, Donald Trump does. I met with Trump in August of 2022 to give him a briefing about the January 6th defendants. He was late, very late to the table, in my view, and I pretty much told him that when I saw him. Because January 6th defendants were asking me throughout 2021 and into 2022, where's Donald Trump? We went to the Capitol for him. Where is he for us? And he hadn't been raising money. He hadn't really met with these families. But he has now. He routinely hosts these families at Mar-a-Lago. He's helped with legal fees. And he has said that he would pardon. Now, I know some people say, well, don't pardon the people who assault a police officer. No, you pardon everyone, or at least commute their sentences. Whole other issue of what police did that day. They started the riot, the police did. And that is video, that is absolutely the facts. So a lot of people who assaulted police or were involved in that was because police were throwing flashbangs, rubber bullets, pepper balls, dousing these people with chemical. These were people outside on the grounds and weren't doing anything. So everyone should be pardoned. Everyone should be pardoned. So Trump would. I think the only other candidate who has expressed sincere pledge that he would is Vivek Ramaswamy. I've been highly critical recently of Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. He has the highest number of January 6th defendants, including, as I said, 2 women from Tampa arrested today. He absolutely refuses to acknowledge this issue. He will not meet, and I hear this all the time, will not meet with his own constituents who are being rounded up, investigated, interrogated, raided, and hauled off to court on these bogus charges. He absolutely, and I've offered, first, very nicely, we have a place in Florida, hey, I'll come and meet, I'll explain what's happening. Absolutely nothing. And now it's just, he's dug in his heels, his team has dug in his heels. He absolutely will not acknowledge this issue and his responsibility to protect the constitutional rights of his constituents against government overreach. That's your job. Just you're the governor. I look at Missouri versus Biden. That lawsuit. They successfully sued the government and tech companies who are collaborating to violate the First Amendment rights of their constituents. That could easily happen in Florida. He won't do it. So I have no faith that he would not only not pardon these people, that he has any plans to shake up the Department of Justice or do anything with this FBI. And certainly Nikki Haley, Chris Christie, who is a federal prosecutor, they're not going to do anything. But it's been very disappointing to hear the silence, I guess you would say, from Ron DeSantis and his campaign. So Trump and Vivek Ramaswamy. What do you guys think of Vivek? Can I just change I'm sure you saw. I'm just curious.
What do people think of Vivek?
That's a no.
I see him as kind of a Manchurian candidate. I think he says what people want to hear. He, back in 2020, he signed a pro-DEI statement. Now he's the leading anti-DEI crusader.
Okay.
So I just don't get the sense that he's actually an authentic version of himself.
Okay.
And I don't
hear
think
that a lot.
DeSantis is either at this point. And I don't think Trump is either.
I know.
So
Right. I think that's well said. Yeah.
I think he's a less authentic version of himself than any of those candidates.
Less authentic. Yeah. Vivek. Yeah. Interesting. Anyone else?
Yeah, so I guess when January 6th happened, that was in 2020. And
2021.
Or 2021,
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah.
And I was in, I was home watching it, and it was a lot different, watching it at home and then coming to Chicago and hearing, the different narrative that was being told. At home, it was, oh, there's some things going on at the Capitol, oh no, a couple freaking out at a much higher like rate than I thought they should be. So I'm just wondering, like, what are some of, and you've already mentioned a lot of them, but what are some of the ways that they have like really kind of rewrote history? And yeah, what are like the major issues that you think people have the most misconception about?
I think the biggest one is that Trump was responsible for what happened. Donald Trump was not responsible for protecting the United States Capitol or Washington, D.C. He never is. That's not the president's job. You have a city, a very small city, by the way, that has the highest number of federal and local police forces in the country. Not only do you have Capitol Police and Metropolitan Police, you've got Park Police, you've got Secret Police, you have DHS Police, federal, I think it's called Dignitary Services. The place is crawling with cops, and it was crawling with cops that day. You just didn't see them in uniform. So Donald Trump is not responsible for protecting the Capitol. So the big question then is, well, why wasn't it? Well, it was left intentionally vulnerable, and we know why, to incite exactly what happened that day. So I think that's number one. I think number two, this idea that, 4 police officers were killed. I actually just heard a judge say that not long ago, that 4 police officers were killed. So that you had police officers were killed, 140 were injured by Trump support. No, it wasn't. You guys injured yourself because you were dousing a crowd with copious amounts of tear gas, and you had 17-mile-an-hour winds, and it was all kicking back in your face. So you were hit with friendly fire, and that's how you were, most of them were injured, which is true. Now, some of them were attacked by people, so I'm not going to discount that. But for the most part, police injuries were a result of them tear gassing themselves.
Killed was
The Brian Sicknick story, we heard he was, bludgeoned to death with a fire extinguisher. That was reported by the New York Times on January 8th. That went on and on for weeks. He got this hero's burial ceremony in the rotunda. Jill and Joe Biden showed up. He was buried at Arlington. Turns out, no, he died of a stroke. Was not bludgeoned to death with a fire extinguisher, and he died of natural causes. Now, tragic. He seemed like a really decent guy. Talked to a couple of his friends. They also are very alarmed by the lies, so that's one. But I think overall the idea that these people went there that day incited by Donald Trump to overthrow democracy, right? They wanted to hang Mike Pence. They wanted to kidnap AOC. They wanted to reinstall Donald Trump and use the military. No, they didn't, because most people actually wanted the events of that day to go on, because it wasn't the certification they were trying to stop that anyone wanted. They were going to audit these 6 states. You had 1 Republican House member, 1 Republican senator. They were going to have 2 hours each to present to the American people all of the voting fraud in these states that really had not been vetted fully in any courtroom or anywhere else. That's what Nancy Pelosi, the Democrats, Mitch McConnell, they all wanted that stopped. And guess what? The insurrection did exactly that. So all of the ideas for this audit commission to vet the election results all came to a screeching halt. They reconvened at 8 or 9 o'clock on January 6th, and all of that went out the window. So when I talked to Trump supporters who got in trouble, they're like, we didn't even really know what was going on, but we certainly didn't want the events of that day to stop. We wanted to hear the evidence. We wanted this 10-day audit commission that 14 or 16 senators had suggested. We wanted the proceedings. We didn't want. We were saying stop the steal, meaning we wanted to hear what was going to happen. So I think those are just a couple of the misconceptions. But don't you find it fascinating that the same people who thought everything else that happened in 2020, especially what happened in this city, not once but twice during 2020, the riots and vandalism and assaulting police, and that was okay. Then all of a sudden you have, this uproar for a couple of hours in Washington, D.C., and it's like the worst thing ever. They can't get over it. So.
I have a question kind of off of that as well. So how much of it do you think is like intentional malice towards Trump supporters, and how much of it do you think is like this epidemic of like Trump hating craze that people have just been completely infected with?
I think it's a combination of all of it. I do. I think they really, this hatred that the media and Democrats and some Republicans have generated towards Trump supporters, that just created the perfect storm. Look, if they could put all of us in prison, they would. I mean, these people are just examples. So, yeah, I think that, and I do think the flip side of that too, is they were afraid that Republicans, if they did keep the Senate, had a little bit of the House, they were going to investigate BLM and all the riots of 2020. So not only did election fraud disappear after January 6th, so did everything that happened throughout 2020, especially in Washington, D.C., where you had some of the worst rioting. I mean, you had rioters who tried to jump the fence to get into the White House, prompting the lockdown of the White House. You had St. John's Church right across the street in Lafayette Square burned. You had federal monuments that were vandalized, just like we saw over the weekend too. So all of that went away too. So 2020 election fraud, gone. BLM riots disappeared. The total fixation was on January 6th. It was a complete success by every measure for the incoming Biden regime, the Democratic Party, and the corporate media. A total victory, not just to malign half the country, but to shut down their two biggest controversies, two biggest weak spots, stealing the 2020 election and trying to burn down the country over George Floyd.
Didn't you have a question?
Yeah.
Hey, Nick.
So obviously, you've seen your fair share of corrupt judges and the like. So with all the Trump indictments relating to this, do you think that he's going to have the same problem with corrupt judges, or do you think they'll actually succeed?
I definitely think they will succeed in Washington, D.C. For the same reasons what you just said. I wouldn't really say Judge Tanya Chutkan, who was appointed by Barack Obama, is corrupt, but I almost have more respect for corrupt judges because maybe they're getting something out of it. I don't know. Let's hope, But she is just so hyper partisan. And I also have done extensive research on her. You can look at my piece at Real Clear Investigations. I poured over 1,000 pages of transcripts from her January 6th trials and proceedings. I mean, she has open contempt for Donald Trump, at one point suggesting that he should be behind bars to one defendant. Also commiserating with another defendant that, yes, Donald Trump, yes, I think he was responsible, but I don't make the charging decisions. That's what she said. So she's the judge handling the Jack Smith January 6th case. You've got 4 indictments, 4 charges, very vague. The obstruction charge is one of them. But more importantly, you're going to have a judge that's going to determine what the government can present as evidence and what the defense can. And you routinely see these judges, whatever the government DOJ wants, they comply with. Whatever the defense wants, no. That witness is not material. No, this evidence is irrelevant. It's not case specific. I've seen it all. She certainly will do that. The biggest question is how are they going to seat a jury in Washington, D.C. for Donald Trump? I mean, not only is it a Democratic city that hates Trump, but they have been bombarded with January 6th propaganda, local and national media, for 3 years by the time jury selection starts. If there ever was a situation where a trial should be changed out of a jurisdiction, it's this. But she definitely will deny any change of venue motion that Donald Trump's lawyers. So then what do? You've got a jury that's going to be made up. Okay, and people say, well, you just need one. DOJ has an almost near perfect conviction rate for January 6th cases in Washington, D.C. Dozens of trials. And you have juries returning guilty verdicts on every single count in record time. One reporter I remember last year when the jury trial started, he joked on social media, we barely have time to file our story about closing arguments before the jury comes back with guilty verdicts. Now, he thought that was hilarious, of course, because, he's on the side of the DOJ. How can you laugh at that? People's lives are at stake, and the system is completely rigged. So this is the same system that Donald Trump is walking into. And Jack Smith knows, special counsel, he has basically no burden of proof. So it's going to be an easy layup for him. So then the question is, well, then what? He's convicted. What are they going to ask for sentencing? You know, he's convicted of obstruction of an official proceeding, conspiracy to obstruct, whatever, fraud, conspiring to commit fraud against the United States, blah, blah, blah. So what do? Come back and ask for 8 years in prison? 10? Judge Chutkan tries to be nice. Okay, I'll give you 5. So the trial's set for March 4th in Washington, D.C. Let's say it lasts till early May. Jury comes back, convicts him on all 4 counts. He's got 2 months then till sentencing hearing. That puts you into the summer. Then he's sentenced to 5 years in prison. Where does he go? You know, how does that work? And how does the country react seeing not just a former president, but the Republican presidential candidate going to prison at the direction of his Democratic opponent's Department of Justice? I mean, this is really, I know you guys are, this is uncharted territory in the United States. I mean, you won't see it in your history books, but you guys are watching this in real time. So that's what's going to be happening next year. And I'm not sure how that all unfolds or what the consequences are, but it's not going to be good.
Well, we're just about out of time here. I guess the last maybe closing thing I'd be curious to ask, piggybacking off that question, your reply is like, if I were to steel man the case for, say, like DeSantis or Vivek, maybe not the others, but at least those two, it would be that whether you love Trump, hate Trump, anything in between, the guy simply, as you just articulated, has so much legal baggage. So what is the argument in response to that in terms of the, Republican presidential landscape, because this is a huge issue for the primary? What is the response to that whether you think it's unfair or not, Trump has so much baggage?
Right. My response is, well, then they win. And my other response is, if Ron DeSantis was 40 points ahead right now, this DOJ would be doing pretty much the same thing to him. They would be investigating him. They'd be coming up with charges against him for, say, kidnapping migrants and sending them to Martha's Vineyard, which they actually threatened to do, using taxpayer funds to do that. So the idea that this is just about Trump, now certainly it is because it started with him, but if Trump were out of the picture and it was Ron DeSantis, they'd be doing the same thing. If it was Vivek, they'd be doing the same thing. Nikki Haley, they'd probably leave her alone because we know she's on their side. Chris Christie, same thing. But anyone who is seen as outside of the mainstream, this DOJ would be doing the same thing. Imagine if Ron DeSantis was now, polls are showing he's basically tied or ahead of Joe Biden in 6 swing states, which we saw with the New York Times poll with Trump and Joe Biden. You think Merrick Garland would sit there and be like, okay, well, we'll see how it goes? No, that's not who these people are. They are full out lawfare. They'd be doing the same thing. So if the thing is, well, Trump has a lot of baggage, and I hear this all the time, okay, but then they succeed in using lawfare, abusing the law, violating the Constitution to strip us of the person who we want to vote for. And you just can't let them, do that. So I know a lot of people are going to vote for Trump. It's your last little way to rebel against this system because it's so stacked against all of us, and especially these other individuals. So that's my response, is
Great.
Then they win and you're emboldening them to do it again, which they will.
Well, thank you so much. This has been great.
All right, guys. Thank you so much.